Good morning. My name is Mary Coburn. I'm a missionary with Baptist Mid Missions to England. Welcome to Women's Wednesdays. This morning, I brought with me a rock. Yes, look at that. It looks like any ordinary rock. A rock that you would find in your yard. Whether backyard, front yard, you'd probably find a rock, something like this. But this isn't just a normal rock. It's special. And later I'll explain why it's special. But first, let's go ahead and turn in our Bibles to Judges chapter 6 and 7. Judges chapter 6 and 7 is about Gideon. But who was Gideon? Gideon was the son of Joash. In verse 11, it explains that he was of the tribe of Manasseh. In verse 15, it explains that he was from a poor family in Manasseh. And not just that, he was the least in his family. He was not ideal for God to use him, but God had a plan. In verse 11, Gideon was hiding. He was hiding thrashing wheat at a wine press. He was hiding from the Midianites. But God sent the angel of the Lord to speak to him. In verse 12 it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him and said unto him, The Lord is with thee, thou mighty man of valor." In verse 13, Gideon explains that he feels hopeless and helpless. Why had God allowed this to happen to Israel? Why was God allowing all these bad and sad things to happen? Well, in verse 14 of Judges chapter 6, verse 14, the Lord looked upon him and said, "Go in thy might, for thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent thee?" And then verse 15, he said unto him, "O my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And in the next verse, the Lord said unto him, "Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man." In verse 17, Gideon said unto him, "If now I have found grace in thy sight, then show me a sign that thou talkest with me." Gideon sought for reassurance. God gave him that reassurance. Gideon asked for a sign 3 times to reassure him that this was really what God wanted. God gave him that reassurance. God heard and answered his request. In verse 35, Gideon called all the men from Manasseh to come and help him fight against the Midianites. Things were looking a little bit better. But then, in chapter 7, verse 2, God let Gideon know there were too many men. Let's look at verse 2. "And the Lord said unto Gideon, The people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites into thy hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, Mine own hand has saved me." Then in verse 3, God says to send some of the men back. He told Gideon to send back the people that were fearful and afraid. Gideon had started with 32 men. 32 men to fight this huge host of Midianites. And Gideon still needed reassurance that God was going to be with him, because this looked really, 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 really hard. And then God sent some of the men home. Everyone who felt fearful and afraid which turned out to be 22,000 men. If Gideon was scared before, he was really scared then. What's going to happen, Gideon thought. But only 10,000 men stayed with Gideon. 1/3, less than 1/3. Oh no, Gideon must have thought. But verse 4, God then tells Gideon again, there are still too many. You need to separate the men who drink like soldiers, drink with one hand on their weapon and one hand cupping water and bringing it up to their mouth, versus the group that drank like a dog, got down on their hands and knees, was getting as much as water as possible. And God said, divide them out. Well, Gideon must have been thinking, oh, Lord, what's going to happen? And then he was so excited. The men that drank like a soldier were 700 men. Yes! 700! That's great! And, the 300 over here that drank like a dog on their hands and knees. And God said, nuh-uh. Wait a second, Gideon. I want you to use this group. The group that are not trained on how to drink like a soldier. I want you to use this small amount of men. 300. Only 300 when going up to battle against a whole host. Just use this 300. The Midianites. The Bible says in verse 12, the Midianites were like grasshoppers for multitude, the host like sand by the seaside. It was a huge amount of Midianites against 300 men of Israel. But God still chose those 300 men because God had a reason. Why would God do that? For the glory of God. In verses 9 through 21, God reassures Gideon again that he is with him every step of the way, that God is with Gideon. And then let's go ahead and look at verses 18, 20, and 21. Gideon said, when I blow the trumpet, I and all that are with me, then blow ye the trumpets also on every side, all around the camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. And the 3 companies, because Gideon had separated the men into 3 groups, all surrounding the camp of Midianites. And in verse 20, when the 3 companies blew their trumpets and brake their pitchers and held their lamps in their left hand and the trumpet in their right hand to blow with, and they cried, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. The Midian camp in verse 21, the whole host ran and they cried and they fled. God brought a great victory that night and the next day. God used that small amount of men for his glory. God had a plan. It was for the glory of God. 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 7b says, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. My rock, it looks normal. It looks average. It's a rock. But it's a geode. What's a geode? Well, a geode looks like a normal rock, but they have crystals inside. When you cut them open, they have crystals showing the beauty of the rock inside. In junior high, I prayed every night that God would take my life and use me for His glory, that God would mold me into a woman in whom He alone would be honored and glorified in and through. In high school, God kept on drawing me toward full-time Christian service, so finally at the age of 16, I surrendered to go into full-time Christian service. But then God started asking me to go to college, Bible college. Now for me, that was impossible, both financially and academically. Financially, my family just didn't have it. All my siblings before had done college by correspondence, doing one class here, one class there, working full-time so that they could pay for at least a few classes of college. But God kept on drawing me to go to Bible college. And not just that, I struggled big time academically. And yet God still wanted me to go. College academically seemed impossible. It was impossible as far as I was thinking, as far as anyone else would have been thinking. See, I'm dyslexic, and reading is very, very, very difficult for me to do. And yet, God was calling me to go to a place that required reading a ton of books. And yet, God had a plan. When I went to college, I studied biblical counseling and it required a ton of reading. And I repeatedly asked God to change His mind. It was so hard for me. And yet, God had a plan. My senior year of college, God started calling me into missions. And God started leading me toward England, where I did my internship. And I found out after I graduated from college that if I had not gotten my bachelor's degree, it would be extremely difficult for me to get a visa there in Great Britain. God knew. I didn't know where He was leading me, but God knew. And God had a plan. God molded me into a woman in whom He alone would be honored and glorified in and through. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, well, whatsoever therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever ye do all to the glory of God. God knew the hearts of the men that He chose there in Israel. God chose those men so that He would be honored and glorified. God knew my heart, and God chose me to go to Bible college for the glory of God alone. There are times that God asks us to do things that are very, very difficult and hard for us to do. Things that people would say, that's impossible for you to do. You can't do that. It's out of the question. And yet God has a plan. God has a plan, and He wants us to seek to honor and glorify Him above all else. When God brings us to a point that He's asking us to do something incredibly difficult, our concern, our desire must be to glorify God and Him alone, to do all to the glory of God. Thank you for joining me for this morning.